¿Han salido los subtítulos?
Sí, perfecto.
Vale, gracias.
One second.
¿Han salido los subtítulos?
Sí, perfecto. Estamos en directo cuando queráis.
Esta reunión está siendo grabada.
Okay, great. Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Mason, and I am a journalist and filmmaker based in London, and I'm the host for tonight's session of Fearless Cities, entitled Are Lobbies All Powerful? Good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Mason, and I am a journalist and filmmaker based in London, and I'm the host for tonight's session of and now I have a problem because the words I just spoke are coming back to me. So I don't know whether or not somebody in the gallery can stop that. And now I have a problem because
¿Puede ser que tengas abierta una ventana con el YouTube, Paul?
just hold, give me a second.
¿Puede ser que tengas abierta una ventana con el YouTube, Paul?
Yeah, somewhere. Ah, maybe that's it. Okay, I have the YouTube on. Okay, I'm good now. Right, we can go. So, yeah, I'm Paul Mason, as I said. I'm the host, and the title of the session is Are Lobbies All Powerful? We'll be discussing the ways progressive and radical city governments can counteract the power of corporate lobbies, be they from telecoms, from housing speculators, fossil fuels, or just plain ordinary finance capital. When cities try to pursue rent control, we've seen from Berlin to New York, they find all kinds of power networks in their way that most people don't even know exist. Democracy fights plutocracy, and unfortunately, plutocracy often wins. So how do we break this cycle? I'm here in London. With me are there will be three speakers. Janet Sands, the second deputy mayor of Barcelona and councillor for ecology, planning, infrastructure and transport, is joining us late because she has an urgent appointment right now to do with all of that. But we will wait for her and see what Janet can offer to the meeting. I'm also joined by Kenneth Haar, who is a researcher from the Corporate Europe Observatory, and Wenke Christoph, State Secretary for Housing in the government of Berlin in Germany, where the German Constitutional Court has recently overturned the city's attempt to cap people's rents. Now, thank you in advance to our interpreter, Oriol, and our subtituladora, Sarah Bonjoch. I want to start by asking both our panelists who are with us to share some intelligence, please. Can you give us, please, an example from your experience of a clear corporate lobby intervention into your city, or indeed any city, and how progressive administrations dealt with it? Can we just start, in other words, with a kind of case study that we can all recognize and then analyze? Wenke, I'm wondering if you could go first.
Of course. Great to be here and join this discussion. I brought a case study, an example from my daily life or in the Berlin administration, And it's an example that I think will resonate with people in a lot of cities because it's involving Airbnb, which is one of the most, I would say, one of the most, interesting like adversaries in terms of our cities and how we want to, keep flats for housing and not like have whole city quarters and neighborhoods overrun with short-term rentals. So if you look at it, we are one of the many cities that is that has started legislation to regulate short-term rentals in the city, to make people register these flats, and even people have to apply to approve that they can rent out their flat as short-term rentals, because it's like usually it's a misappropriation of housing if you just rent it out as a short-term rental. So what we've seen so far and in the last years is that Airbnb regularly asks for appointments with the city government, with our administration, and offers collaboration, offers cooperation agreements. Like, it would be so much easier if people could just register their short-term rental online. It would be so much, easier for everyone, for the administration, for the people who want to like do this sharing economy stuff and so on, and that all our approval procedures are way too complicated and take a long time and whatever. And that's a conversation they've been bringing to the table for years now, totally ignoring that it's not just about registering flats, but it's about like clear procedure of approval procedures, and you don't have a right to just rent out anything as a short-term rental. So what we've seen is that they are using the media to, like bring up their these so-called collaboration procedures. But on the other hand, Airbnb is not willing to actually conform or like follow the law that in Berlin says that you have to delete every offer that does not have a registration. You have to actually also give us the data of people that have illegal offers. They don't do that. They never come to the talks on collaboration with an offer to actually follow the Berlin law, and we've brought them to court for that. And we actually won now at the administrative court in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, that they are actually, the court followed our argumentation that they have to follow our law, and their arguments that they are in Ireland and the data security laws and so on prohibit them from giving us access to illegal offers and so on. That was not followed by the courts. So what we're doing is to bring them to court to actually follow our laws, and we are trying to even to amend the law to make it even harder for them to use loopholes for not following the law. And that is maybe one example, very practical, and maybe a small example of how lobbies, like lots of other actors, want to influence policy, want to influence legislation, want to influence administration procedures. And maybe to sum that up, for me, I think one of the most interesting and important parts of that is to not only talk to them, but to actually talk to all the other actors in our cities who are involved with the question of short-term rentals, for example. So to do hearings, to do public debates, to put transparency into the question, and not just talk with some of the lobby groups behind closed doors, maybe as one first starting point on this debate.
Before we go on, I should just mention to all panelists and attendees, we have at the bottom of your Zoom, in the bottom menu, there is a live transcript, and there is also buttons you can press to get translation. There is English and Spanish translation. So please go there to get the appropriate translation for you. I should just mention that this is my ever-present helper, T, my dog, in in the lovely sunlight of London. Now, Kenneth, can I bring you in? And have you got a case study you could talk to us about?
I mean, I happen to know a bit about Airbnb, so if it's okay with you, I think I'd add a perspective to what Venki just said, because actually, I mean, in terms of fighting the power of corporate lobbyists, Airbnb is not. It's not I'd say it's a rather positive story in some ways. If you go back about 8 years, you would see that letting via Airbnb exploded. And in many cities across Europe, not just Berlin, but Barcelona, my own city, Copenhagen, Paris. I mean, all over the place, you saw cities that quickly began spotting the negative outcomes, which were that thousands and thousands of apartments and houses were taken off the market and not anymore available to locals.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty quickly, many cities started responding. I mean, Berlin was one of them. There were many others, and Airbnb responded, of course, with classical lobbying, endless knocking on doors of decision makers, a flood of reports that showed how beneficial they were to everybody. They experimented with mobilizing their hosts to come to their defense. And yet, I mean, broadly speaking, they lost. They lost politically. I can't recall, I don't think I know any story of a city that had to drop their idea of resistance in light of a fierce lobbying campaign by Airbnb. And I think it's because this is an issue where many citizens were engaged immediately at an early stage. They were able to keep city councillors to it. I think it was because the stakes were so obvious and clear. So yeah, in that sense, Airbnb has been a success story when it comes to fighting lobbyists. Then I hear from Venke that when we come to the courts, it's a different matter. So with Airbnb, I'd say for some years now, you could say many battles have been won, but the war is definitely not over there yet. There are some legal battles ongoing, and there's a political battle, which incidentally is not unfolding in cities, but at the European level. But I think perhaps we can return to that later.
Okay. Just on the Airbnb, while we're talking about, we're using Airbnb as an example. What's interesting is that Airbnb seemed, I think, in many of the cities we're talking about, it did kind of half-heartedly try to mobilize the landlords, the house owners, but it was nowhere near the level of intensity that, for example, Uber did in New York City, where they were pushing via the Uber app, petitions, ideology, propaganda, and in some ways, after all, property is part of the analog world. There are property laws that no matter how much you put a kind of digital reality on top of them, the property laws exist. But to that extent, Airbnb seemed to be able to deal with its own lobbying itself. I'm really interested to find out whether or not there were third parties or unannounced secret or subtextual campaigns that Airbnb deployed either in Berlin or Copenhagen itself.
I mean, those campaigns did exist. And I mean, not only a few months ago, there was a report out from the University of Manchester that analyzes examples from both from Europe and the US. In the US, Airbnb came from a situation where that kind of mobilizations had been hugely successful. In San Francisco, for instance, they defeated the proposal for a law that would have made it more difficult for Airbnb to operate in that city. They've been, and you've seen, I mean, there are similar examples in Europe, not as powerful. I'd say they've not been as successful in Europe as in the US with mobilizing the hosts. They claim that it's been helpful, even in regulatory battles. But I have not been able to identify a single example where it's been substantially successful, so to speak.
Okay, and Venka, any further to add on the Airbnb example?
Yeah, like I have a similar impression like Kenneth, that actually the mobilization of hosts here in Berlin is not very apparent with Airbnb. There's more like there's a couple of like local associations, like of smaller groups of landlords that that are specifically there with their short-term rental business plans and want to keep this going. And they are more, they're more involved in networking here and lobbying on the local level. Like I did not have the impression that that Airbnb was able to like really mobilize people at least in the last couple of years to a bigger extent here in the city. And I think maybe more generally, I think that Airbnb really does have a certain image nowadays. Yeah. Like generally in like bigger cities that have the experience of Airbnb and the short-term rental problem. I think there's like general negative association with the company and with the whole issue of short-term rentals. And I think that's maybe also something where maybe, I don't know, maybe they tried to work against that, but maybe realized people it's maybe not that good an investment in this general frame of mind that people have.
Okay. I mean, Kenneth, I wanted to turn to you and ask more generally, what is the changing pattern of corporate lobbying as applied to municipal governments? I mean, we're all used to, corporations themselves, bribery. Here in London, there is almost legalized bribery through the planning laws. But how is that changing when we see, the use of social media, AstroTurf, WhatsApp? How's to you as an expert on this? What are the new things that we're tending to find?
Can I say what the old things are that we always find first? Because I mean, I think it would be a mistake to say that the classical lobbying is out of date or on its way out. I think we will still see that the dominant activity of companies that want to influence decision makers is public affairs work. They either do it themselves or they hire someone to help them. I mean, I would put it like this: if they can handle the issue by merely having meetings with a mayor or with city councillors and not having so much fuss in publicity, I mean, in public, that would be, by far the large majority of lobbyists would prefer to handle it that way. But then on the other hand, I mean, sometimes that's not enough, and then they have to figure out new methods. And some, you mentioned some of them: astroturfing, social media. About astroturfing, some can use it successfully, most can't, I'd say. It has been difficult for Airbnb to repeat the success that they had in the US. I'd say a company like Microsoft has used it very, very cleverly, but that's a Brussels example. It's not from municipality, but they ran something they called the Alliance for Creativity at some point, which from the outside looked like a big club for computer geeks, but it was really just the biggest big tech companies in the world defending intellectual property rights. social media. I mean, I'd say it depends on the circumstances. It depends on whether a company, a big business, sees the need to influence public opinion, which is not always the case.
And Wenke, in Berlin, you know, we know that ultimately the rent cap ran into the problem of the Constitutional Court. But in the process of mobilizing against you, how did the landlords use the lobbying apparatus?
Now that's one of the most interesting, I think, issues of the last maybe 2 years of Berlin politics, the rent cap and all the debates around it. And maybe to start, I think maybe from a different point, I would start from a different point of like looking at the public debate. I think we need to go one step before, like what was how did we actually get the possibility to create the rent cap as a quite radical legislation to limit rents? And I think this opportunity was created not only but very majorly by and the campaign that is now going to have a referendum in the city to expropriate big housing companies. That is such a radical idea that people brought in, different movements and different actors from the tenants movement brought into the city, that this created the opportunity for the Red Green coalition here in Berlin to actually say, okay, we can do something, and we can offer a legislative step in this process. And what happened? What happened is that we got this coalition, also involving Social Democratic Party, to pass the rent cap. And even in that, like very quickly in that process, we saw that the housing associations, even some cooperatives, even also some like city-owned housing association, landlords and their associations, they organized very quickly against this legislation, and brought in all kinds of media activities, social media activities like Twitter. There were poster, advertisement campaigns and so on in the city that tried to delegitimize the rent cap in a way to like say, regulating rents does not build new flats, with the whole idea of that only building new flats will solve the housing problem in the city, and that always tries to delegitimize regulation of rents, of rising rents, because, and like with a very weird idea that there is like this clear market and only demand and offers are the problem, and not speculation and financialization of housing. And what they brought in was the argument of the rent cap being unfair, in terms of that we would even cap rents of people who have a lot of money and who could even pay more rent. But so these were maybe two of the key arguments, and they used, I would say they generally used very classic instruments of public campaigning. They used collaboration with the media. There was, of course, there's a clear collaboration with people from the Conservative Party. There's like the Conservative Party here in the city got almost $1 million in company donations this year from real estate companies and actors for the election campaigns and so on. And yeah, as I said, media campaigns, Twitter, and so on, but there was less about like astroturfing or something. It was more about very clearly like corporate actors using quite classic instruments of campaigning.
What often puzzles me, what I am constantly thinking is, how do we end up with a situation where liberalism and liberal democracy accepts almost permanent preferential access to lawmakers by corporations in a way that no group of citizens can ever achieve? It's the most bizarre thing. As you know, here in London and in the city of London, the financial district, we have a near permanent situation where both our national government and our city government are obliged to take a wall of meetings, a literal wall of meetings with corporations, and yet their own citizens can never communicate with them except through it as a kind of sort of like a clientelistic pleading, please listen to me. Is there anywhere in the developed world where there is best practice for leveling up the access mechanisms between corporations and citizens?
Well, maybe that would be the point, I think, where Janet would be great to jump into the debate.
Yeah.
I hope she is going to join us soon. But I think, like from our experience in Berlin, I would say, for example, planning law in Germany has to have public participation steps. They are quite formal, but they need to be there. And they need to be done in order to pass any kind of planning. And what we started in the last couple of years was to build up from that and put offices for participation into every neighborhood in every district in Berlin, and one for the city. So I think one of the key aspects is to actually change the access of citizens into to influence administration directly, not only every 5 years or 4 years in the elections.
Yeah.
And this can be done. And we started these offices, we started all kinds of guidelines for public participation in different, not only planning procedures, but also in different issues just of how does my neighborhood develop and what do I want to change? Maybe one idea.
Kenneth, what about you? Is there anywhere that has a kind of exemplary law leveling up access?
No,
No,
not to my knowledge. So yeah, I mean, I can give you a few examples from here and there. I mean, including in my own city, Copenhagen, where you would see, at least on paper, and the intention of the city to consult with citizens on many issues. In practice, it rarely plays out like that. I can show you though some impressive texts that have come out of some of the European institutions lately, where you really see something that looks like that we're about to have a bright future. For instance, I think if you look at the rules of the European Commission, at least if you go back a couple of years, you will see that they feel obliged to consult broadly with people that represent different interests in society, different perspectives.
Mhm.
But I mean, reality is something completely different. I mean, quite the opposite. Yeah. I mean, our group regularly uncovers how the European Commission prefers to speak to people that represent one side of things and none other.
If we're going to get some collaborative progress out of this Fearless Cities engagement, what from both of you, what laws and at what level would be the most useful for people to pass? I mean, as you say, someone said in the discussion, you know, at European level, we are seeing a commission and that is responding to the crisis of legitimacy. We are seeing, obviously, mainly right-wing governments, centre-right governments across Europe, or centre-left coalitions that are useless. But what law, if you could wave a magic wand and pass a law, what would it be?
I mean, depends on whether we're talking about a utopian law that will solve the problem,
How about
the imbalance
law?
once and for all. But if I was to be very practical, I mean, we always have a battery of proposals about lobbyists and how to roll back their power. It always starts with something very simple, namely transparency.
Yep.
In the European institutions, that struggle has played out around the so-called transparency register. We've worked on getting a useful register of lobbyists in the EU institutions for many years, and we've got one now. It's definitely not perfect, but you're actually able to go to a place and check out whether this or that company is active,
Yeah.
more or less what kind of money they spend, more or less what issues they work on. It's a big step forward, and it's something that should be replicated all over the place. And I want to stress that it's definitely not an ideal register that we've got, but it's, I mean, the situation in Brussels now is much better than it was, say 10 years ago. And I could add four more things: a code of conduct for lobbyists, rules for civil servants. They should have to make declarations of interest. We should have strong rules on revolving doors. We should have rules on conflicts of interest. So yeah, that's a very quick way of presenting my shopping list.
What's interesting is that everywhere where you see right-wing populism, I mean, in Britain, we have a conservative government, but it's really run by a sort of shadow party inside it, which is effectively a right-wing populist party. They have begun, on every single one of those agendas, they have begun to push back. So they invented an entirely new form of civil servant called a non-executive director, where they could literally bring their friends into a government department. And the other thing is they have, throughout the COVID campaign, which of course is not primarily what we're talking about here with cities, they have normalized the practice of ministers using WhatsApp and private email, so that there is no paper trail for procurement decisions. And I think that what we will see in the United Kingdom is exactly this begin to happen in the city administrations where the Conservatives are trying to take power. Fortunately, there is only one major city administration, which is in fact the region of the West Midlands, where the Conservatives have held it. Everywhere else is currently social democratic controlled. But it's almost like they took your list, Kenneth, and they reversed it, and they removed every control that they could. Vinka, when it comes to Berlin, what were thinking about this? The problem you had of the Constitutional Court. How do you deal with that? Because the German Constitution is immutable. So what are you going to do?
Well, I think the answer to that question is quite simple, because let's review what the Constitutional Court actually said in their, how do you say it in English? The decision? Yeah, just the decision. Right? So they, in their decision, mainly just said that we as a federal state do not have the authority to legislate rent prices.
Okay.
Because it's, their argumentation is that rent prices are legislated on the federal level of Germany, and that in terms of like how to view this legislation, it just like it's final on that level. So there's no possibility for federal states to add to that. So there's one simple thing that you can do to change this situation, and we are planning to do that, like on with the city administration as an initiative in the Bundesrat, which is the chamber of the federal states, and of course it will be a topic in the upcoming federal elections. It's just like a simple sentence to put into federal law, into the civil law on the federal level, that federal states with maybe like problematic housing markets are allowed to add to that legislation. It's one simple sentence that could be added on the federal level, and then this could be like an opening clause in a way for city governments to come up with rent cap legislation or different legislation to limit rent increases. That would be one of the simple things you could do, but you have to have necessary political majorities to do that. And one, I think, important point in that way is that I think there will be no federal government in the next couple of years with the participation of the Conservative Party that will be willing to do that.
Yeah.
So we need a different majority on the federal level, without the CDU, without the Conservative Party to do that, to actually enable states or cities to have different rent legislation, or to actually pass like a more strict rent legislation on the federal level. Both would be good, actually. And maybe to add one more thought to that, well, I mentioned that before, that the Conservative Party is deeply connected with the real estate lobby in Germany. There's like all the donations that you can see, and that have to be put into the transparency registers. There's really close connections. There were both court procedures from Conservative Party MPs and from the real estate companies and so on. So they're very close in terms of their interests. And maybe to add to one to the ideas that Kenneth brought in to limit lobbies, I would add that we need to strictly limit or even forbid donations for parties from companies, from private companies.
Yeah.
I think this some countries do have that, or they at least have a limit, but we don't have that yet in Germany, and I think that's completely necessary because it really changes the playing field for parties to campaign and to use that. And we are seeing that in Berlin, like the Conservative Party already started to put up huge posters against the expropriation campaign. And this is going to go on for the next 2.5 months.
Great. I just want to mention to our audience, small as it is, we've got a few people in here, including Rita Silva, who has her hand up. Thank you. Can you type your questions into the chat? Because then the translators can translate for us so that I can then ask them to the panelists. Before we do that, I want to just come to a final set of things, and we're still waiting to see whether Janet can turn up. That is, it's fairly clear that the corporations have like an international, so that when they discover a successful tactic against a municipality, they can generalize that across the corporation. Cities via the Fearless Cities initiative kind of are linking up, and we see today, you know, from the agenda today, many different lawmakers in cities linking up to try and generalize knowledge. But how can we ever raise that to the same level of speed, effectiveness, professionalism? What do either of you think about the way we form a city international to try and fight the corporations? What would it consist of?
Well, I mean, for a start, I'd say what we desperately need, and that would perhaps be a first step towards the Fearless Cities International, would be a Fearless Cities Europe.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean something pretty specific, actually. I think this question is a no-brainer. The cities have so much in common in that a large part of the framework that they work under is determined in Brussels. So if we could return to the Airbnb, for instance, when Airbnb can fight cities successfully in courts, it's because countries have laws that are derived from European law. So a significant part of the battle around Airbnb is taking place in Brussels. In fact, in the next 1.5 years or so, the future of how cities can regulate Airbnb will be decided in Brussels. So, I mean, obviously, cities have to work closely together to influence that, to politicize that discussion. Another example is that the European Commission has for a while been seeking the power to stop new city-level rules in the making if they feel it goes against the disciplines of the single market. So, I mean, the short version is there is so much going on, so much being decided in Brussels that touch on the on politics in cities. So, I mean, the very first priority should be to figure out between cities, how do we work together to ensure that we can retain or expand the space that we enjoy to do progressive politics at the local level. And cities will need each other to do that.
I mean, is there a, on other things, for example, decarbonisation? If a city wants to decarbonise, then it looks at best practice in other cities, and there is often a very well developed consultancy, expertise, polling, even professional framework, but it doesn't really exist at the level of anti-corporate, does it? Or does it? I mean, obviously,
No,
yourself.
I don't know. I don't think it does. I mean, but cities get experiences, and that's a good point. I mean, I know that in Barcelona, for instance, they've had a huge fight over renewable energy and energy poverty, and corporations have been part of that as well. And the experiences in Barcelona, surely, I mean, they're valuable to many other cities across Europe.
Yeah, I think I would echo that as well. It's a source of frustration here in Britain that the experience of Barcelona, but also some of the less radical, but nevertheless fairly radical cities, I'm thinking about Helsinki as well, just in progressing the basics of a sort of progressive policy. And in the UK, no one is interested. What we have in the UK are a series of, our city governments are powerless. That's the number one problem. They have almost no power, except to open up planning opportunities for high-rise United Arab Emirates owned and Chinese development. That's all they do. But our town councils, the ordinary basic level councils, they do have power, and yet the level of political literacy among the social democratic and green and liberal, left liberal lawmakers who run these cities is low. So they wouldn't even know that Fearless Cities exists. So just creating a kind of supply that sometimes the supply creates the demand is an important thing, I think, to come out of this initiative. Venka, I wanted to ask you again about what kind of professionals did you use? Did you just simply use the city council's civil service, or did you have to add to this some extra political campaigning muscle, as it were?
Well, let me answer to that question, and also to the one you asked before. Like, maybe when we talked about the rent cap, or bringing in the rent cap as like a novel legislation, there was a lot of debates around that, and a lot of involvement of actors outside of the administration, because, to be honest, most of the people in our legislation, especially the legal experts, were quite skeptical about it. Yeah. And there was like, we brought in, and also political actors, like the political parties forming the coalition, brought in legal expertise and studies and so on from different, like both from constitutional, constitutional law, from housing legislation and so on, to actually enable this process and bring up a creative debate of how we can understand both constitutional law, like opening up, as we saw it 2 years ago, opening up the possibility to actually legislate rents on a federal state level. And that was a quite, it was a lively debate also with with people in the administration, with people in the political field, and legal experts. So that was, I think, a crucial point, because very often, maybe saying that also from my experience now in the last couple of months in the administration, mostly administrations follow a logic that follows security as a principle, like being sure about what you're doing, having checked all the maybe legal problems that might come with a decision or with a law, and being more careful about it. And what the rent cap tried was not to be careful, but to be fearless in a way, and to be courageous in a way. So that needs a lot of like pushing from the political field, from activists, from the coalition parties, also to make this possible and to bring also an administration to the point where we can be creative and try to find solutions and try to find ways to legislate. And maybe if I can, I would also answer to the question of like the fearless international or the fearless
Yeah.
Europe. And yeah, I would echo what Kenneth said. I think the European level is actually one of the most interesting in a way, not only because it like concentrates and focuses a lot of challenges or a lot of problems that cities have to tackle together, but it also includes the political platform or the political scale where we have to do it. Like one clear example, I think we were kind of touching it before, was the fight against Airbnb and some of the other platforms at the European level involved with the Digital Services Act that is being discussed now, and where there is actually a network involving Barcelona, involving Berlin, involving Amsterdam and other cities that is quite active in the last 2-3 years as a cities alliance against short-term rentals or like limiting short-term rentals in our cities, and where we've had talks with the Commission, talks with the European Parliament. And I think this is this kind of networking, very practical networking for the interest of our common interest of our cities, is something that can really bring together very practically the administrations and decision makers, because in the end, it's also a question about, is it just an interesting, trip to another city, or like a debate that might be interesting, or does it have potential direct effects on my my administration or the way that what I want to do in my city?
There is a question in the chat raised by Rita Silva, and thank you, Rita, for your question. She says, I think the scale issue is crucial. Even the regulation around rent control could be at federal level, and the EU would, i.e. in Germany, and then the EU opposes it. So the EU is a kind of structure that seems to be designed to address corporations and lobbies and not public participation. And it's interesting to hear that question. In Britain, where we're facing a conservative government, what's happened is that the left has taken refuge at the level of municipalities, because there are things you can do, even if you can't do at national level. So how do we empower? The question is, do we want to empower cities? Because by empowering cities, you are also, in some senses, vacating the European-wide, federal German-wide level of struggle. How do you negotiate that problem, either of the panelists?
You mean the question of competences and mandate and? Yeah,
where is the best? I mean, if we take the premise that we are trying to empower cities, is the city level legislature the best way the place to start, or do we start at the top?
Well, maybe if I can jump in, I would say it really depends. Like you can see that in some cities, the left or progressive forces can actually come to a majority where there's clearly no possibility for them on a federal or national level. Like one example would, for example, be there's also people from Zagreb, here would be Zagreb, where you have a quite conservative national politics, but they were able by organizing on the long run in Zagreb on the city level to actually now have a progressive mayor there since a couple of weeks or like 1 or 2 months or so. So I think it depends on what we see and what we can like analyze in terms of power, like where can we build power from the left or from progressive forces. But then I think cities will always in the end come also to a point where we will find out that without some changes on the federal level, and the rent cap was just one example, without some changes on the federal level or even on the European level, our possibilities on the municipal level are very limited as well. Because very often the possibilities to legislate some of the key issues we need to have changed in our cities is not with the city itself, or is quite limited. So I think in the end, we need to talk about the different scales. There's not just one scale that is better than the other.
Kenneth?
Yeah, I mean, my short answer to your question, should we empower cities, is yes. And I think, I mean, that I would say that's the immediate task. I think what we've seen over the past decades, I think is probably that the space left to cities to pass laws, to regulate, has diminished.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, I think the time has come where we should perhaps take a clearer collective stand on that point and start identifying I think many areas that really should be handled at the local level without any undue interference from either the national level or the European level.
Yeah.
I tend to look at a lot of this from the European perspective, because it's kind of my job to stare at the European institutions. And I mean, we've done a lot of analysis the past 2-3 years on how the EU institutions continuously identifies areas that they think should be regulated in Brussels and not in cities. And in many cases, I think we're getting to, I mean, absurd situations. And I think Airbnb is probably a good example. I mean, the answer to the question, who is best positioned to determine what kind of regulations you would need of short-term rental platforms? Is it people in the European Commission, or is it city councillors? I mean, it's almost a joke to have to say that question, but I mean, currently the feeling in Brussels is that, I mean, we need rules that make very, very clear this can be done in cities and this cannot be done in cities.
So Rita is saying she agrees with the local organization emphasis. I should also say that we've had a message from the Fearless Barcelona and Cómo organizers saying that Janet cannot come. It's an error, a problem with her schedule. She can't come, which is a disappointment, because we have so much to learn from Barcelona in its war over bicycles, its war over Airbnb, and indeed Uber and everything else. So it's a shame. I think what I will do, therefore, is because we have a small audience and we have just the two panelists, maybe we would just ask the anybody else in the chat, in the attendees who wants to ask a question, just signal now. But apart from that, I think we have kind of covered and indeed we've covered the topic. Is there anybody else who wants to ask anything? While we're thinking about that, I will just say it's been interesting. I haven't had time to plunge into the Fearless Cities, the wider agenda. But what do the two of you who are participating, what do you think is possible that we'll end up coming out of this whole thing with? What's the next thing we need to do?
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of on the use of the initiative, but
Kenneth, to me, you've frozen. I don't know whether. Okay, no, you're.
Am I back?
You're back now. Yeah. Yeah, you're back. Go ahead.
Right. Okay. So where to go next?
No, again, you've frozen. Venka, come in, help us, save us.
I'll add my thoughts, and maybe then Kenneth is going to be back online. Well, I think Fearless is a great, can be a great inspiration, like this series of events and like bringing so many people from so many different cities and contexts together. And I think one of the next steps is something that the Fearless initiative has tried for the last couple of years as well. Like not only doing conferences in Barcelona or online or the book on fearless cities, but to actually do this in different, they did this in different regions. And I think the idea was behind that to actually initiate discussions around municipalism, like local politics, local organizing, and about the question of how can we network, how can the different local initiatives network. And I would like to see that we can, you know, like coming out of this time of the pandemic where it was not possible to meet and to see and to visit other places and learn from each other, that we can find ways to collaborate online, but also offline again, and build more of these fearless initiatives in our cities. And I've been involved in Berlin in a municipalist network for some time now, where we're actually trying to bring together all these different people from the movements, from left and green parties, and people not yet that much involved with activism for decades. And I think that would be great if we can inspire more people to in different cities to come together and to actually, what we said, to build this international together.
Kenneth, you are now back. Just give us the final word.
My next step, if I were in the middle of fearless cities, I'd say I think this is the time where cities should get together and be clearer about what they think their mandate should be vis-a-vis the national level, and not least the European level. And I would pick this time because there's on the table that I find risky and depressing. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you to both of you. I hope you can enjoy what's left of the evening. I think here in London we have one. It's there in Berlin and Copenhagen. Hopefully you have something left of the evening. And to our audience who have been faithful with us, thank you for coming. I hope that Janet will be able to participate in a future discussion with the two of you and myself. I was looking forward to that. So we will just leave it there. The session, of course, has been on YouTube, and therefore will be available to a lot of other people to watch over time. I've learned stuff. I hope you, the people in the audience, have learned stuff. Thank you for coming, and we will end the session there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Good luck.
La grabación se ha detenido.
Yay, good.
Great.
Kenneth,
Thanks, Paul.
you. Yeah. Hey, Benka, I'm sorry about that. It was a small session and it went a bit. Janet didn't turn up. I don't know. I've never met her before, but I was given a long brief about what she wanted to say, but she didn't turn up to say it. Listen,
I think we met actually in Janet and me in one of those like very quick EU level consultations with on Airbnb. But everyone was just talking for 2 minutes and then was done.
You know, if I could write about the Berlin situation. When would be a good time to write about it?
Well, I think anytime before the elections would be great. I would say sometime in September.
Yeah, I will. Well, I can, because I work mainly now for the New Statesman, which is weekly stupid centrist magazine, but its Europe editor lives in Berlin, Jeremy Cliff. He used to work for The Economist, but I think it would be quite nice to do a story about about the whole exact, not just like with detail, but with political analysis about how the local, national, regional laws worked together and how you overcame them. It would be a good thing. So I will
Yeah.
contact you and see if we can do that.
That would be great. And also the other thing would be, I think the one of the interesting parts is the different like laws and how they interact in the Berlin situation. But it's also, I think, from an analysis of movements and political space and political opportunity, Berlin is a great example. Like the expropriation campaign created the space that Social Democrats would, only that created the space for Social Democrats to be part of the rent cap. And now